Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I clicked the wrong button, sorry. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight is our ongoing series of occult and crochet topics. And we're going to go over one of the New Thought leaders, an author that surprisingly has influence even in today, and someone that I heard about 15 to 20 years ago, and immediately went out and purchased his book and was very impressed, to say the least. So, who are we talking about? We are talking about Charles Haanel. And if that name sounds familiar, you'll find out shortly why that name sounds so familiar. So the information about Charles Haanel and his family is interesting because there were several Haanels as I was digging through this, and a lot of the information that's out there, probably the best source, is from the Charles Haanel website. Yes, there actually is a website for it. I linked it in the description. You can check that out if you're interested. But I also dug around on several other sources, so some of what's out there is a mixed bag. And even amongst the main biographers that I was going through, there is some questions. So some of the stuff I will point out when it's could be a couple of different options. So to start off with, the Haanel family was primarily of Swedish descent. There's, again, a little bit of variance here, but the primary belief is they were Swedish descent. His parents were living in the country of Prussia, but eventually moved to Canada, and then to the United States, which is where Charles was born in May of 1866. It was said that he was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to his father Hugo Haanel and his mother Emmeline Fox / Haanel. There are a couple of different stories. This is where I first really got bogged into some of the chaos. One of the sources says that Charles was the firstborn of 7 siblings. Another says that he was 4th in the line of 6 siblings. The line that says he was the firstborn also states that 2 of the siblings didn't make it out of childhood, and it was him, one other boy, and the rest were girls. In the other one, he was one of 2 boys, and the rest were girls. So, take your pick. Either way, the family would eventually move to Missouri when Charles was still a very young child. It was here in St. Louis that a young Charles took his first job. Again, sources are a little bit mixed on this, but they're saying sometime between the ages of 12 and 15 is when he started this job. The job was as an office boy working for the National Enameling and Stamping Company. Interesting name, interesting sounding company. Not as interesting as you might think, though. For 15 years, he remained at this company, working in various positions, working up quite a ways from just office boy to fairly high ups from what it looks like. Again, sources are a little bit mixed here because there's some overlapping information. One of which is it appears that Charles may have went to college while working at this company, but also Charles would leave the company at some point, and again, this is where the timelines don't quite line up as neatly as we would like them to, because he did leave the company, that's for sure, after 15 years, and he would become a writer and be involved in various aspects of business as a fairly successful businessman. But this is where some of the blur occurs. In 1885, he would get into the publishing business, and after buying out his investors and partners, Charles would establish the C.F. Haanel Publishing Company. But according to some sources, he was still working for the other company when he established this one. So basically, he was working 20 hours a day between his own company and the National Enamel. So this is kind of like a crossover where you're not sure which one was going on when. And it was from this area that he would become mixed into the world of bigger business. So once he established his own business, he eventually would leave the other business, the enameling business. And from here, he would get mixed into a coffee company, a sugar company, and several other commercial business ventures, one of which was a kind of land slash investment company with it looked like eucalyptus and sugar cane, I believe. At least that's what my notes say. It was an odd company. That particular company didn't do well, but his coffee and basic sugar company did very well, which was pretty interesting. And during this time, he was studying and learning different aspects of religion, Eastern spirituality, and looking into what was known at that time of psychology. It wasn't as broad-ranging as it is today, but he was still looking into it. But Charles' life was not just working 20 hours a day and in doing all this investing and planning and business stuff. Again, crossover, dates don't quite add up. Between 1885 and 1888, he would marry Esther M. Smith, who he had met at the enameling and stamping company. So it was before he left the company, but the dates are, like I said, a little bit interesting there. Charles and Esther would have either 3 or 4 children. Again, sources. One source, the one thing that's consistent is Charles and Esther only had one son, and it was either 2 or 3 girls. Esther would pass away, though, in 1904, so their marriage was only, 16 or so years is what it looks like. 16 to 20. Sorry, I'm not sure what my problem is tonight. In 1908, Charles met and married Margaret Nicholson. Not much is said about this particular marriage outside the birth of 2 more children, so that's just kind of that was his personal life. That at least is what you could find about it. Over his life, Charles was a Freemason, and it looks that he may have been as high as 32nd degree Scottish Free Rite, which is impressive to say the least. He was also a member of the Shriners. He was a member of the Pi Gamma Mu fraternity. Yep, little frat bro there. But in a more serious tone, he was also a fellow of the London College of Psychotherapy and a member of the Authors League of America. And considering how much he eventually would write, that part's not that surprising. In Charles's more metaphysical leanings, though, he was a member of the Society of Psychical Research, a member of the Society of Rosicrucians in America, and the American Suggestive Therapeutical Association. Those are all things that we've touched on in other stories, but basically he was very much into how the mind influences the world around him. It doesn't look like he buried himself too deeply into the more esoteric branches of some of these groups, but he definitely was involved to a certain extent, which was not always a good thing because it led to a little bit of scandal that is purported to have been with him during some political intrigue in the early 1900s. His name pops up in a couple of articles, or at least his last name does. So it could have been a different Haanel. And it tied him to the American Rosicrucian Society. So you never know what's mixed in there. But Charles did receive honorary degrees outside of his actual schooling. The interesting ones to me, because he had 5 or 6, but the ones that kind of stuck out for our purposes here with the occult and metaphysics was the Metaphysics in Psychological Doctorate from the College of Metaphysics, and a Master's of, or an MD, sorry, from the Universal College of Dubleix in India. So he actually had a couple of interesting ones that are specific to metaphysics and the mind. Basically, Charles was very, very smart in a lot of ways and was recognized with these honorary titles and degrees, because an honorary degree generally is you have shown exceptional skill, knowledge, and leadership within a certain area. So without having to go to 4, 8, or 12 years of university or college, you still get the degree kind of as a way for a school to say, hey, you know what you're doing. So that was pretty cool. But that's kind of where his storied and mixed information life starts, and we'll get into a little bit later. But that's not the thing that would make him well known. The thing that brought him the most long-lived fame, his most well-known book, began to be published in or around 1912, when Charles was around 46 years old, and this was the Master Key System. It was released in 24 pieces at first, but it was consolidated into one full book, full volume, in 1916. The book is basically a course book integrating new thought practices, mind over matter type stuff, mental development, personal health, and of course, why would you leave this out? This builds the ability to create success in finances and in life in general. And it was said that by 1933 he had sold over 200,000 copies. That is very impressive for the time, if those numbers are to be true. One of the articles that I saw referenced that the book was going for between $3.50 and $6 per copy, depending on where you're at, hardcover, softcover, all that stuff. Which, for the time, it doesn't. Today, that sounds like pennies for what this book was. But at the time, that was the equivalent of buying the 4 or 5 of the Harry Potter books when they first came out, which was like $35 a piece. So, bringing that back to reality in that respect, this book was very expensive, but people really couldn't get enough of it, which is pretty cool. The thing to me, though, is it's not that important how many books were sold. It's what's in the books, because that particular book is very, very cool. Charles was said to own several businesses during this time, the sugar, the coffee, things like that. And he actually practiced the beliefs he espoused in his books. Hello, Serge. He claimed the practices in the books were the reason for his success. They were things that he had actually done and developed to bring him the success in business. I've read this book, years ago when I first found out about it, and I'm gonna dig it out and reread it, because some things in life, how life goes, not a bad idea to keep refreshing on stuff like this. And his book in particular is the way it was established, the way you work through it. The cool thing to me about the Master Key System is that in each chapter there are exercises for you to perform, and at the end of each chapter there's a few questions, usually it's around 4, to help you really lock in the information that you were reading. And if you are the type of person like I do, when you're going through a book along those lines, you try each practice as you're going through the book. And I've done that with many other books over my lifetime, and it does help you anchor the teachings more fully into your thoughts, your mind, how things kind of work with that. This system builds as you go, though. So it's not like, I'm going to read this chapter, I'm going to jump ahead, and then I'm going to come back. Don't do that. He established it to be a course, starting with chapter 1, ending with chapter 24-ish. So you don't want to skip around. You really want to work through each one because they build on each chapter. The chapter builds on the chapter that was before. So you want to build up through it. He really did purposely set this up as a system. It's what he did to develop his business success. And he wasn't a multi-millionaire when he died, but for his time, he was living very comfortably, and he did leave a minor estate to his descendants. And when I say minor, it wasn't like a corporate oil baron type thing, but it was definitely enough that they weren't worried about finances like some people can end up that way. And some of the other people we've talked about end up very poor. That was not the case with Charles. Charles did write other books, and I can honestly say that I have not read these. I've never even heard of most of these books because the one book that stuck out, because it's the one I heard of, was the Master Key System. I do want to get to more of his work because I did truthfully enjoy the Master Key System that much that I would like to go back over it and see what else he wrote. In 1922, the Mental Chemistry book was published. In 1924, he published New Psychology. And in 1927, a book called, this title kills me, A Book About You. That was published in 1927. 10 years later, he co-wrote with author Victor Simon Pereira, The Amazing Secrets of the Yogi. That was in 1937 was the publication date. And all of these books are linked in the description down below if you're interested, as well as a couple of other ones that were influenced by Charles Haanel. And the links are affiliate links, so when you click on those, it does help support the channel here. And it gives you some pretty good research that you don't have to go digging for yourself. Charles Haanel passed away in November of 1949. He was 83 years old. That's exceptionally long-lived for that time period. And he was buried in the Belafonte Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. His wife, Margaret, second wife, remember, followed her husband 2 years later, dying of what is said to be a cerebral hemorrhage. The years between his last book in 1937 and his death, though, are lost to time. As much as I dug around, poking, trying to find some reference to him during that time period, I really couldn't find anything that happened in that era. It could be that it just wasn't that interesting, so no one wrote it down, or it could be that he just retired, lived off his investments and savings, and stepped away from the public life. Can't really complain about that. I would love to be able to do that. He actually, unlike some of the other ones we've talked about, he did die with money. He wasn't overly wealthy, as I said before, but he was not poor by any means. He died comfortable. Charles's influence, though, was extremely far-reaching, especially when you realize who all was popping up in the same time frame. A simple author and businessman probably wouldn't have made it very far in the occult or metaphysical community if it wasn't for the Master Key System, to be perfectly honest with you. It is said that he had ties to the New Thought and Christian Science movements, which there's some interesting rumblings as I was poking around, because he never outright espoused these two groups, according to what I could find. But they claim connection to him. which doesn't surprise me considering his thoughts were very much similar to theirs. His writings influenced the author Napoleon Hill to write Think and Grow Rich, which is an interesting book. I'm rereading it right now, and I forgot some parts about it. Let's just put it that way. But he also inspired a more recent author, one you might have heard of before, and that author's name is Rhonda Byrne. She wrote The Secret after her daughter gave her the book, according to her story, The Master Key System. When she was having a really rough patch in life, things were just falling apart, and her daughter was like, "You need to read this, it will help." So after she went through all 24 chapters, really put, mind into it, she developed and wrote the book The Secret. She collected all other teachers today that are still using this type of knowledge. Some of them, I question, but there's other ones that are very much tied to this type of knowledge. So I added that down there in the links if you're interested, just because it's it was what brought my attention to Charles Haanel was her work. I can't say any more than that because that's literally how I found his book. He was a man very much ahead of his era. He was a bit of a visionary. He looked into various religious and spiritual beliefs and practices from around the world. A lot of what he looked into and researched was from the Eastern religions, but he also studied the Middle East religions and Christianity more in depth than a lot of people in that time. And he also found ways to tie that information into the more modern sciences of the mind and psychology. Again, not something that was very commonly done during that time. Everyone was trying to separate the mind and the mental capacity from spirit and soul, and he was like, no, bring them back together. they work best together, which I agree. The one thing that can be said of Charles Haanel throughout his life, reading his work, the book that I've read anyway, and as I was going through researching this gentleman, you tend to learn a lot about a person just kind of poking around and what are the stories, the side stories. There was a whole section about his political scandal, which I kind of ignored because that's we're not talking about politics here. But there was a little branch of that. You kind of learn a lot about somebody when you're going over it, even for something short like this. But the one thing that really stuck out to me is he practiced what he wrote about. He didn't preach it. He didn't beat you over the head with it. He simply showed you, this is what I've done. What do you think? Like it, yes or no? And he wrote those lessons down on paper, and they were published and people spread them around, but he actually practiced it. It wasn't just, I'm doing this to, sell a million books or whatever. He practiced what he preached. So, something to think about when you're out there selecting your next self-help or metaphysical, new thoughts, manifestation type book. When you look at their life, can you see how they wrote the book? Can you see how they achieved what they did before the book was published? Because that's the trick. He had a very successful life before he even published his first book. And he explains how he did that through the Master Key System. And then from what I could find, he delves a little bit deeper into the workings of that in his future works. So, if that's something you're interested in, as I said, links in the description. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit that like button. Drop some comments. Let me know what you think, if you've read his work, if it's been influential to you, or any of your other thoughts about it. And any constructive criticism is awesome. Like I said, as long as we can be respectful, that's all I can ask for. With that, I will let you guys go, and I will see you in the future videos.